Welcome to Learn, Create, Sew. This is lesson number 2 in our Learn to Sew series. In this lesson, we're still going to be hand stitching. Today, we're going to be making rice bags. And on these rice bags, we're going to learn different decorative stitches, as well as talk about the importance of placement and sizing of our stitches. It's recommended before you do this project that you're familiar with slip stitching. There's a link below to my skill building lesson on how to slip stitch. We're going to be making 2 different styles of rice bags today. I have a sloth and an owl that you can choose from. We're going to be adding decoration with a blanket stitch. We're going to close it with a slip stitch, and we're going to do our edge stitching by hand using a back stitch. And we're going to focus on keeping our stitches really small so that when we flip it, we can't see them. In this project, we're going to be using regular all-purpose thread. As a result, our stitches will have to be much smaller and more exact. For this project today, you're going to want cotton fabric for the body of the rice bag, some scrap felt for decoration, as well as rice to fill it. You're also going to want thread, and I'm going to be using lots of different colors for my project today. This is a project that could definitely be made on the sewing machine if you're already familiar with how to use one. However, in my sewing classes, we always make this project by hand. It teaches you some important skills that are good to know for the future. The first thing you're going to want to do is go to my website and print out the free pattern. The link to my website is below. I have 2 decorative patterns available. These are just 2 ideas for the decoration that you could add to your rice bag, so you could always add a different design if that's something you'd like to do. I'm going to begin by making the owl, so the first thing I did was I cut out my pattern on the solid line, and I cut really careful to make sure that it has the correct shape. Now I'm going to take my cotton fabric and I'm going to fold it so that it's right sides together. The colors on the right side of the fabric are usually much more vibrant than on the wrong side. Place your pattern on top of your fabric, and I like to trace around the edges. You could use pins if you'd like to, but it's a little bit difficult in the heavyweight paper. And cut around the line you've just drawn. When you're cutting your fabric, try using mainly the back edge of the scissors. If you use the point of the scissors, sometimes your fabric can end up jagged. So cut using the back and stop before you get to the point. And turn your fabric as you need to. You should now have 2 curved rectangles for your rice bag. I'm now ready to add my felt decoration. So from my pattern, I've also cut out the wings, the large eye circle, small eye circle, and the beak. You can choose to sew these decorations on by hand or to hot glue them later. If you're planning to hot glue your decorations on, cut out the pieces using the dotted line. If you're planning to sew them by hand or by machine, cut out on the solid line. I'm going to be hand sewing my decorations on, so I've cut mine out on the solid line. The advantage to sewing your decorations in place is that they're less likely to fall off, and if you heat up your rice bag, you don't have to worry about your pieces moving, where with hot glue, when the glue heats up again, you could lose some of your decoration. I'm going to start with preparing the wings. Just as I did my main fabric, I'm going to trace it and cut it out. It's really important when you cut out your felt pieces to be really careful. The edges of this fabric will be visible on your final project. So you're going to see the edges that you cut. So take your time, cut slow, and be as careful as you can. And remember, it can help to use the back of your scissors and avoid using the point to prevent jagged edges. And then notice that most of the time I keep my scissors stationary, but turn the felt. Repeat this process for the other decorations. When tracing shapes on really dark felt, I found that works best for me is just a black Sharpie. It's still a bit difficult to see, but you can usually make out the edges of the shape. If you don't have a black Sharpie, you can also use a soft light colored chalk. I've cut out all my pieces and I'm ready to add them to the front of my rice bag. Take the piece of fabric that you would like to be the front of your rice bag and lay it right side up. Place your pattern next to it so that you can see where all of the items are. I'm going to start by adding one of the wings. I'm going to look at my pattern and line it up, and I can see that the wing goes along this edge here. I'm going to use a pin to hold that in place. Since I'm going to be hand sewing today, I do want to make sure I have my pin cushion handy so that I make sure all of my pins and needles are in here and not on the floor. I'm going to add one piece at a time so I don't have to worry about a lot of pins. I'm going to be using regular all-purpose thread for this project. It's good to practice using regular weight thread when you're sewing, because this is what you're going to be using most of the time on your sewing projects. Since this thread is really skinny and thin, you want to make sure that you have a needle that is also very skinny and thin. You also want to make sure it has a teeny tiny hole. That means your eye is really, really small. Because the thread is really thin, we want the eye of the needle to be really thin. You also want to make sure that it's sharp so that you don't have any trouble going through your fabric. I've cut a piece of thread that's about 30 inches long. You don't want it to be too short because then you'd have to change it all the time. And you don't want it to be too long because then it will get tangled. Make sure that the tip of your thread is newly cut. Hold it really close to the end and slide it through the eye of the needle. When we did our first project, we were sewing with yarn, which is really thick, and so we only used a single layer of thread. For this project, we're going to do what's called double threading. Since our thread is so thin, to make it stronger, we're going to double thread our needle. So pull your needle until the ends of your thread are together. This means that your needle will be at the halfway point, and your thread tails, the very ends here, will be the same length. So let's go ahead and tie a knot. To tie a knot, you can wrap the thread around your finger, use your thumb to roll it off, take your middle finger and pinch the end of the thread, and then pull it gently with your left hand. This creates a nice knot at the end of your thread. Also, to help prevent tangles, you can use wax or thread conditioner. Simply lay your thread over the wax, use your finger to hold it in place, and slide it through. I like to do that 2 or 3 times. Once you have your piece in place, we're going to go ahead and do a blanket stitch. We're going to do a blanket stitch all the way around this interior edge. There's no need to do it along the far edge because that will be caught in our seam allowance later. But anything that's going to be in the middle of our owl or our sloth, we're going to want to do the blanket stitch on. For more information on how to do blanket stitch applique, you can watch my skill building video, which is linked below. First, anchor your first stitch. Come up from the back, down right next to the edge of the felt, and up right where you started. Go under the loop for your first stitch. Once your first stitch is in place, Go over a little bit, go down through the front, up right next to the edge, and make sure that you go over the top of the thread. Occasionally, when you're sewing with double thread, one of the threads will pull faster than the other, leaving a little bubble. If this happens, separate the two threads and pull them one at a time until the loop disappears. Then you can put them back together and continue sewing. Guide your thread to the left, in through the front, up through the back, over the top of the thread, and pull through. Guide to the left, front to back, up and over the thread. If you start to run out of thread, stop, put your needle back down right at the top of your stitch, and pull through to the back. Tie your knot. Rethread your needle and keep sewing. When you come back up, put your needle back up just to the right of where you stopped and continue sewing. Don't forget to check periodically on the back to make sure that there are no loops or tangles. You'll add most of the decoration to the front of your rice bag just like that. Sometimes sewing pieces that are really small or have a lot of angles can be difficult to sew with a blanket stitch. So for example, the small eye on the sloth or the owl can be tricky, as well as the beak on the owl. So to do that, what you can do, instead of doing a blanket stitch, you can do a regular whip stitch. It looks much the same, it just doesn't have the thread on the outside. To do the regular whip stitch, start with your needle on the back just like you did with the blanket stitch. Come up from where you want your stitch to begin on the inside of the eye. Place your needle down along the edge of the felt and pull through towards the back. Then come up for the next stitch. And down at the edge. Repeat this process all the way around. If you want to, you can do this in one step instead of two. So when you put your needle down into the fabric, you can angle it up where you want the next stitch to begin at the same time. And then when you pull, you'll finish the previous stitch and start the next one. And then when you get to your last stitch, poke it through to the back, pull it all the way through, and tie your knot. To do the mouth on the sloth, I'm simply going to use black thread. So I've threaded my needle with black thread, and I'm going to come up from the back to hide the knot. This is where I want the mouth to start. And I'm going to go exactly across and poke it down where I want the mouth to stop. I'm going to come back up exactly where I started and pull it through. I'm going to do that one more time. Careful that your thread lays flat but doesn't pull the fabric. You don't want to get gathers. Then go down where you want the mouth to end and poke it towards the back. Once you've added your decoration to the front piece, you're ready to put it together with the back piece to create the rice bag. The next step is the same no matter which style you're doing. When you sew your rice bag together, you have to leave what's called a seam allowance. The seam allowance is the space between the stitches and the edge of the fabric. There has to be space here, otherwise the stitches could fall off and you end up with a hole. It also makes your project not very strong. So where you see the dotted lines here, that is our goal for where we want the stitches to be. We also have to make sure that we leave an opening so that we can turn our rice bag. So in between these two big dots here, we're going to leave that open so that we can turn. So we are going to start sewing approximately on this dot. We're going to sew all the way around and we're going to stop here. We're going to sew with a back stitch like we learned in lesson 1, and we're going to use that stitch because it's nice and strong and will make our rice bag as sturdy as we can when we're sewing by hand. We also need to remember that we're going to be filling our rice bag with rice. In order to make sure that the rice doesn't fall out of our rice bag, we have to make sure that our stitches are really small. Our stitches are going to have to be smaller than a grain of rice, otherwise it won't work. My goal is usually to make them about half the size. It will also help make our rice bag strong. If you're worried about not making an accurate seam allowance, you can use your pattern piece to help you. Go ahead and trim the pattern at the dotted line. Take the back piece of your rice bag and lay it right side down. So you're looking at the wrong side. Center your pattern piece on the fabric. It should be the same distance from all 4 sides. Use a marking tool to trace around. If you're doing it all in one sitting, an air erase marker is really nice. But if it's going to take you more than one day, that could vanish. So I'm just using a regular pencil and I'm going to trace around the sides. Now this isn't something you want to do for every project you sew, but if you're just beginning, it will give you a good guide. I'm also going to mark where my big dots are. That way I know where to start and stop. I now have a line to follow when I do my stitches. It may also be helpful to turn it to the right side and draw a mark just in between these 2 dots. Now be careful because you could potentially see this on the outside of your project if you're not careful. But this will help you know where to do your slip stitching when we're done. I'm going to do the same thing on the front piece. Center your pattern piece and draw a line between the 2 dots. Now this won't be perfect, but it will help give you an idea. Now that our markings are in place, take your 2 pieces and place them right sides together. So you should only see the wrong sides of your rice bag. Line up the edges as best you can and use a few pins to hold it in place. When you use pins, poke it all the way through both layers of fabric, tilt it up, and go up through both layers of fabric. So on one side, you'll see both the point and the ball of the pin. On the other side, you'll see a long metal section. So I'm gonna add just a couple. And now I'm gonna start stitching. Normally, if I was sewing this together, I would use thread that really matches. This pink would be perfect because I don't want to see these stitches at all. Unlike the stitches I did here, these stitches aren't decorative. They're merely to hold it together, so they're not stitches I want to see. So this light pink color would be perfect. However, since I want it to show up in the video, I'm going to use a dark pink color so you can see it. But if I was actually making this project for myself, I'd want to use something that matches. So go ahead and thread a needle, double thread it just like you would have if you were doing the blanket stitch. I'm ready to start sewing, and like I mentioned before, we're going to use the back stitch. So if you recall, when you do the back stitch, start from the back side a little bit away from your starting point. So since this is my starting point right here, I'm coming up just a little away from that. Go back to the start, poke it all the way through, and then come up a little too far. Go back to where your previous stitch ended, come up a little too far, and pull it through. When you do a back stitch, your stitches should be touching, so there's no space in between. Check the back frequently to make sure that your thread isn't tangled or knotted. Go back to where you started and come up too far. Remember, our goal is to make our stitches about half the size of a grain of rice. So if I take my grain of rice and place it next to my stitch should be smaller. And as I sew my stitches, I'm following my line. If you're doing your back stitch in one step like this, always double check the back side to make sure you're really going through all the layers. This is especially important in the sections where you're going through the felt. This is a great way to practice stitch size and placement. Keep it small and keep it on the line. If you find you have a hard time doing it in one step like this, you can always do your back stitch in 2 steps. So go all the way down through all the layers and then all the way up through all the layers, and that is just fine as well. Some people prefer that, especially in the sections with the felt, because your fabric's just a little bit thicker, so it can be harder to angle it. But make sure you go through all the layers. When your thread starts to get short, don't forget to stop, tie your knot, and get more thread. I'm going to continue this process all the way around, stopping here at this point. And chances are my thread's not going to make it that far, so along the way I may have to stop a couple times, tie a knot, and get more thread. It's better to do that than to work with thread that will be really long and tangled. I finished stitching around the edge of my rice bag. What I'm going to do next is a few clips along the curves. When you have a sewing project that's curved on the corners like this, all of this fabric here has to fit in this small space here, and it doesn't always like to do that. So what we do is we cut little triangles in the fabric so that when you fold it in, it has the space to curve in. You have to be really careful with this. Your clips have to stay really tiny, and if your stitches were too big or too close to the edge, this won't work. It will just make your holes worse. So you really want to make sure that you've got your good seam allowance and your stitches are small. When you cut your curves along the part that's rounded, it's not necessary on the parts that's straight, but around the parts that are rounded, you're going to cut little triangles. I'm only going to cut them about 1/8 of an inch tall, so about half the size of my seam allowance. Just some teeny tiny triangles. So you can see right here that I'm not close to my stitches. I'm still pretty far away. And I'm just going to do 3 or 4 at each corner. This will help my fabric to turn. I'm going to do 1 more, so that's 5. So 1 right where it starts turning, 3 along the curve, and 1 where it stops turning. I'm going to do this on all 4 corners. And also make sure there are no clips in the section where you're going to do your slip stitching later. So no clips in the opening. This is a great time to use little detail scissors if you have them. My curves are all clipped and I'm ready to turn. So to turn, place your forefinger inside the opening and place your thumb on the outside. Pinch it close to the opposite end and then push your thumb up through the top. Grab it and very gently turn it right side out. Before I fill it with rice, what I like to do is get my slip stitch section ready. Remember the marks we did before on the front side? You can see where those marks are. That's about where we need to do our slip stitching. So we want to stay far away. So tuck that section into your opening and use your fingers to press it closed. So you should have 2 folds tucked into your opening, and the bottom should kind of look like it's been sewn. Give it a good press with your fingers. And now I'm ready to fill it with rice. When you fill it with rice, I found it's helpful to have a funnel as well as a friend to help you. So one person can hold the rice bag and the funnel, and then another can scoop it inside. It can be kind of messy, so be careful and maybe have a vacuum broom ready. To help prevent the mess, you can go and pour it in small scoops. I also like to shake it to help it go inside. Now, how much rice you put in is really a personal preference. I like mine pretty full. I put 1 cup of rice in my rice bag. And I'm going to use a clip to hold this closed. And I'm going to get my needle and thread ready to do a slip stitch. If you've never done a slip stitch before, it's a good idea to learn before you do this. You can take a look at my skill builder video, which is linked below, for how to do a slip stitch. For a slip stitch, remember to start inside the project and come out on the fold of the seam right next to the opening. Make stitches parallel to the fold, exactly across from each other. Again, you have to keep your stitches really small, smaller than your grain of rice, otherwise your rice will fall out. Tie your knot. Poke your needle back through the seam allowance, out through the side, and trim your thread. If you haven't yet added any decoration to your rice bag and you wanted to hot glue your pieces on, now's the time to do so. Once you have the bottom closed with your slip stitch, you're ready to decorate it how you like. Just take care and be careful with the hot glue gun. Remember to roll your fingers quick if you get any glue on your fingers to help prevent burns.